At first glance, Eastern Europe looks like it lost the Cold War. On modern maps and in popular memory, the region is often described by what it lacked: wealth, freedom, and opportunity, as if its history after World War II was simply the result of ending up on the wrong side of an ideological divide. But that's not what happened. Eastern Europe didn't stumble into a broken future, it was sealed into it. After World War II, the region was promised stability. Instead, it inherited a system that froze life in place, quietly cutting off paths that never reopened. What followed wasn't immediate collapse or mass violence, but a chain reaction that locked the region into decades of stagnation, despair, and decline, all traced back to decisions made before the war had even ended. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to the moment when the war was still being fought. By 1943, World War II had turned decisively against Nazi Germany, but victory was far from clean. The Allies were winning, but they were exhausted and deeply aware that the war's end would immediately create a new problem. Who would control Europe once the fighting stopped? The continent had already torn itself apart twice in a single generation, and no one wanted to risk a third collapse or spark another conflict. What mattered most wasn't designing the perfect peace, but preventing another war. And nowhere was that problem more urgent than in Eastern Europe. To the east, the Red Army was advancing at a staggering pace. Soviet forces were pushing westward through Eastern Europe, liberating territory from German occupation while suffering catastrophic losses to do so. Entire Soviet cities had been erased, and tens of millions of Soviet citizens had died. For Joseph Stalin, security became urgent because the Soviet Union's western borders had shown how easily armies could cross them. Eastern Europe had been the invasion route for nearly every major attack on Russia in modern history. Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics were corridors through which destruction had arrived again and again. When Soviet troops crossed into these regions, the aim was to push the Soviet frontier westward and lessen the possibility of another invasion from Europe. To the west, Britain and the United States faced a different fear. They needed the Soviet Union to keep fighting. Any collapse in cooperation could prolong the war, cost hundreds of thousands more lives, and possibly allow Germany to regroup. So the question shaping the end of the war was never whether Europe would change. The question was whether Europe could be stabilized fast enough to avoid another catastrophe. By late 1943, Allied leaders were already thinking past Hitler, weighing what the post-war balance of power would look like. As the war dragged on, it became clear that borders would be decided by presence on the ground rather than debate after the war. That reality surfaced clearly at the Tehran Conference. For the first time, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met face-to-face. Publicly, the focus was defeating Germany. Privately, the conversation kept drifting forward. Poland, Germany, Eastern Europe. What would happen to these regions when Nazi control collapsed and a vacuum replaced it? The answers to this question were uncomfortable. The Red Army was already inside Eastern Europe, and no Allied force was in a position to remove it without another war. Britain and the United States could either accept that reality or challenge it, and nobody wanted to prolong World War II or ignite a third war immediately afterward. So instead of stopping Soviet influence, the Western Allies began negotiating its terms. The language was deliberately careful, describing Soviet occupation as temporary, security as mutual protection, and future elections as something that would come later, once stability had been secured. By early 1945, the Yalta Conference marked the moment when those discussions turned into concrete commitments as the end of the war drew closer. At Yalta, the Big Three effectively agreed that Europe would be divided along the lines where their armies stood at the end of the war. The Red Army controlled the East, and Western forces controlled the West. Yalta was essentially a formalization of what had been discussed at Tehran. From there, each side took action. Across Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed governments took power as political systems were reorganized, economies were centralized, and borders were secured, creating a sense that order was finally returning. Employment became nearly universal, and despite deep repression, there was no immediate famine, no widespread civil war, and no collapse on the scale many people feared. After years of invasion, bombing, and occupation, that stability mattered. For many people, predictability came to feel like peace. With guaranteed work, quieter streets, and the pull of daily routines, life appeared to be stabilizing. Governments functioned, borders held, and employment remained high, while crime stayed relatively low. From the outside, the region appeared orderly, even disciplined. But stability did not lead to growth, it led to stagnation. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the gap between Eastern and Western Europe was no longer shrinking, it was growing. Factories kept running, but improvement carried real risk. Production targets were set from above, years in advance, and treated as promises rather than goals. Exceeding them didn't bring reward, it rewrote expectations. When a factory produced more than planned, that success became permanent. Quotas were raised, but resources were not. The same workers, the same machines, and the same materials were now expected to do more forever. And when that inevitably failed, someone had to explain why. Engineers learned that new ideas created scrutiny instead of opportunity. Workers learned that the safest way to survive was to repeat yesterday exactly as it was. Over time, an entire region adapted to this logic, not because people lacked skill or ambition, but because the system trained them to treat change itself as a threat. While the rest of Europe moved forward, Eastern Europe learned how to stay still. Across the Eastern Bloc, alcohol consumption rose sharply, particularly among working-age men. In the Soviet Union, alcohol-related illness became one of the leading causes of premature death. Life expectancy stagnated and then began to decline, a pattern almost unheard of outside war or famine. Suicide rates followed the same trajectory. By the 1970s and 1980s, countries like Hungary, East Germany, and parts of the Soviet Union recorded suicide rates far higher than those in Western Europe. These were not societies in open collapse. They were societies where frustration had no outlet, ambition carried risk, and change felt impossible. Another major reason Eastern Europe stagnated was the lack of freedom to leave failing regions. Travel was tightly controlled, immigration was treated as betrayal, and attempts to leave could cost people their jobs, their freedom, or in some cases, punish their families. The borders that defined Eastern Europe were no longer just military lines. They were protected by international agreements, enforced by alliances, and treated as untouchable in the name of peace. Even when the system's failures became obvious, undoing it meant reopening decisions made under fear at the end of a world war, and any challenge risked escalation between nuclear-armed powers. By the 1980s, Eastern Europe's system was already strained. Growth had stalled for decades, industries were inefficient, and governments were spending more just to keep daily life stable. Much of the region depended on cheap energy, subsidies, and political backing from the Soviet Union to keep things running. Then, the Soviet Union changed. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the mid-1980s, Moscow could no longer afford to hold Eastern Europe together by force. The Soviet economy was stagnating, oil revenues were falling, and maintaining control over the region had become an unsustainable burden. For the first time since World War II, the Soviet Union made it clear it would no longer use military force to enforce the post-war order. That single shift unraveled everything. Eastern European governments had survived for decades because everyone knew the Red Army stood behind them. Once that certainty vanished, authority drained away. Pressure that had been building for years surfaced almost overnight. Protest movements that have been suppressed for years began to emerge, especially in places like Poland, where solidarity had already exposed the system's limits. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, not because it was stormed, but because no one was willing to enforce it anymore. State industries across Eastern Europe shut down rapidly. Jobs that had existed for decades disappeared within months, and unemployment became widespread in societies where work had previously been guaranteed by the state. Entire towns built around single factories were left without an economic base, and social support systems collapsed faster than new ones could be created. At the same time, Eastern Europe was pushed into a global economy it had been largely sealed off from since World War II. While Western Europe had integrated gradually over generations, Eastern European economies entered all at once, with outdated industries, limited capital, and little protection from competition. When borders opened, the region faced another loss. Many of the people best positioned to rebuild left. Younger workers, engineers, doctors, and skilled laborers moved west in search of stability and opportunity, leaving behind older and poorer populations. Over time, that loss compounded. Populations aged rapidly, birth rates fell, and working-age populations shrank, leaving fewer people to support weaker economies and strained public services. What began as an economic shock evolved into a long-term demographic crisis. The human cost was visible quickly. Suicide rates rose across much of the former Eastern Bloc, and life expectancy dropped sharply in parts of the former Soviet Union. Today, the effects remain visible, not just in income gaps, but in communities that never recovered the people and time they lost. Eastern Europe didn't fall behind because it lacked stability. It fell behind because stability came without the ability to adapt. During the war and its aftermath, the region was locked into a system designed to prevent another European catastrophe. In doing so, the system prevented another war, but limited Eastern Europe's ability to grow and adapt over time, a cost still visible to this day.